the publication of this report is one of the most important days in the history of this illness. With its preeminent roster of scientists and experts, rigorous methodology, and forthright conclusions, this is the substance that we, who care deeply about this illness, have long needed. Again, I'm Carol Head, president of the Solve M.E. CFS initiative. I'm also a patient. I was quite sick 30 years ago for many years, and I know personally the deep despair of being very sick, not knowing why you are sick, receiving no help from conventional medicine, and being dismissed and ignored. However, I'm one of the very, very fortunate few who has mostly recovered from this disease, and I understand full well that I dodged a bullet, that so many of the people who were sick at the same time I was all those many years ago are still sick. I'm proud now to serve the Solve M.E. CFS initiative. It's the longest standing organization in M.E. CFS in the United States, and our mission is to make M.E. CFS understood, diagnosable, and treatable. And I'm proud of our Solve M.E. CFS Biobank, an asset for all qualified researchers in the M.E. CFS SEID community. And I'm proud of the research that we've funded over the last 7 years. I do want to do a quick call out of thanks to Mary Dimmock, for allowing me to use some of her research in the data that you'll see in my comments here today. I would also say our organization does not purport to represent all patients. No one can do that, but we do purport to use rigorous research, evidence-based data to obtain additional research funding for SEID. To be clear, that's why we are here today, because it's time for our government to increase funding and support for this disease. We believe that the IOM report is a turning point in the history of this disease. So here's a summary of what I'd like to talk about with you today. First, what does the IOM report change and why is it important? Then some background on ME CFS. I think there are many folks, perhaps some in this room and perhaps others who are watching online, who may not have the deep familiarity with the illness that we do. Why does this disease matter to all of us, to everyone, not just patients and their families? At what levels has NIH funded ME CFS research? And frankly, most importantly, what needs to happen now? So what changed 6 weeks ago when this report was published? Well, for all of us who are patients, this report is like confirming that water is wet. We already knew that water is wet. We already knew that the illness is real. To quote the IOM report, and as Ellen just said, it's a serious, complex, multi-system disease. In its most severe form, this disease can consume the lives of those whom it afflicts. But we patients who already know this are not the audience for the IOM report. The audience is legislators. Thank you for being here. Doctors, federal officials, and private foundations who now see the official stamp of approval that yes, indeed, this is a serious, debilitating physical disease. We believe that this report is the defining moment for two key reasons then. First, the federal government has now clearly affirmed this, that it is a disease and not a syndrome. And for the millions of Americans who've long suffered with skepticism and lack of care, the affirmation alone is deeply helpful. And for the doctors, nurses, and medical researchers, this definitively places this disease in its rightful place. And therefore, there now exists no credible barriers to significantly increasing medical research funding for this disease that will lead to treatments and cures. Federal agencies and private medical research foundations now have a bright green light to move forward with substantial funding, commensurate with the number of Americans who suffer with this illness. The seriousness of this illness can now only be refuted by those who choose to be ignorant. And at the same time, what didn't change 6 weeks ago when this report was published? Well, ME CFS continues to be that complex multi-system disease that is still at a very early stage of medical research and understanding. It can be reasonably debated whether this disease has aspects that involve the immune system, neurological system, genetic components with epigenetic effects, viruses, endocrine systems, bacteria, brain and spinal cord inflammation, and many others. Rigorous research has been done into all these areas with many compelling and interesting research results, but nothing yet definitive. And importantly, there are very few research dollars available to replicate even these most compelling findings. Also, ME/CFS research is not far enough along to be of interest to pharmaceutical industry funders. The potential sources of private funding are quite narrow and utterly insufficient to solve this complex disease. And of course, we know, the other thing that has not changed is that hundreds of thousands of patients continue to suffer in deep pain, usually without a diagnosis, locked inside bodies and minds that are no longer able to serve them well, and almost always without a doctor who can help them, and with zero FDA-approved drugs or therapies. I think of William, who became ill with this illness in 1986 at age 12 and was diagnosed 5 years later at age 17. He was unable to attend high school but obtained his GAD with the highest score ever in his state. He's now 29 years old and is now often too ill to prepare or consume his own meals, speak on the phone, or write with a pen or pencil. It's quite common that he's housebound for weeks at a time. He's quite sensitive to light and noise and therefore often lives in a sort of sensory deprivation. And of course, he is in constant pain. It's been 17 years. William wrote, "I am among the more severely affected, those in the lower 25% of functioning. Is our country willing to let so many lives like mine be left like detritus on the highway, largely ignored? The loss to the nation and to the world is uncalculable," unquote. And there are hundreds of thousands of Williams who suffer intensely, and we can and must change that. For those who are somewhat new to this illness, this disease, I pause for a moment to consider, why has this disease been so poorly supported with federal funding for so long? I mean, it is puzzling. So first, as Dr. Clayton has mentioned, most people have not believed that it's real. The most common patient experience is to be told, even by medical professionals, that it's all in your head. Get over it, buck up. I was told that. We don't tell people with MS to get over it and buck up. We don't tell people in end-stage cancer to get over it and get on with their lives. We take those diseases seriously, and we show compassion for those who suffer with them. And that's what patients who suffer with this disease need and deserve. Second, the name of the disease, as Dr. Clayton has mentioned, has kept it from being taken for the serious, debilitating disease that it is. It's generally been called chronic fatigue syndrome. Well, first, we don't usually describe diseases by a symptom. For example, we don't call lung cancer chronic coughing syndrome. To quote the IOM report, ME/CFS patients, quote, are more functionally impaired than those with other disabling illnesses, including type 2 diabetes, congestive heart failure, hypertension, depression, multiple sclerosis, and end-stage renal disease. So having called this serious disease by an inappropriate and frankly lightweight, insulting name is one of the factors that has kept doctors, friends, family members, employers from affording it the seriousness that's warranted. Third, the disease has been poorly defined, which means that diagnosis can be difficult. That's not at all uncommon in a multi-symptom complex disease with symptoms that appear in other illnesses as well and can be difficult to measure objectively. There's no simple blood test. There are no simple genetic tests for diagnosis. Some of the newly discovered biomarkers are few and cannot be done yet routinely in a doctor's office. And as it's genuinely complex and difficult to diagnose, doctors face an overwhelming amount of information to absorb. They have 15-minute appointment slots in their days that are already filled with time and financial pressures. With this new IOM report definition of the disease, which is clearer and simpler, diagnosis can become much more straightforward. Fourth, this disease has been incorrectly described as a psychological illness, and still is in many, if not most quarters. This mistaken attribution of a physical illness as a psychological illness has often occurred historically with diseases that are complex, and particularly when the primary sufferers are women. Certainly, we recognize that psychological illnesses are real and cause extraordinary pain. We do not disparage psychological illnesses, but it is simply not true that ME/CFS is among them. This IOM report clearly puts that long-standing, damaging misconception to rest. And last, Most medical professionals demonstrate little understanding of the illness. Dr. Lenny Jason has clearly documented that most medical school textbooks in schools do not present meaningful information about the disease. So even new medical school graduates today either are not informed or are misinformed. And a 2013 meta-analysis of 34 studies reinforced the patient-reported themes that they have experienced as they've sought medical help of stigma, challenges in getting a diagnosis, skepticism, minimization, and misunderstanding on the part of medical providers. Again, the IOM report emphasizes the importance of our medical professionals being properly informed about this complex disease. So all 5 of these core issues were addressed in this rigorous IOM report, and that's why this report is a seminal moment in the long and painful history of this disease. So next, why should we believe that this issue should matter to all of us as Americans, not just patients and their families? The ME/CFS SCID economic burden on our nation is significant. Our government has estimated a $17 to $24 billion economic burden on the nation due to lost productivity, indirect, and direct costs. The slides that scrolled across the screen with comments from patients earlier on emphasize time and time again that what patients want most is to rise from their beds, be productive, and eager to work and to lift the burden of their care from others. This is patients' most fervent wish. And there are so many who suffer. The IOM has estimated 836,000 to 2.5 million. The CDC had estimated 1 million Americans, and certainly there are millions upon millions upon millions of individuals around the world who suffer with this illness. This is not a rare disease. I have a chart now that is from the Institute of Health, and there are 4 columns. I hope you can see them. On the left are listed 5 different diseases or illness conditions. Then we have the funding for those diseases in 2014, this year, in millions. Then we show the estimate of the number of Americans who suffer with the illness, and you do the simple math, and you have then, in the right-hand column, the dollars spent per patient. So we see, for instance, with lupus, that it's $283 per patient, multiple sclerosis, $255 per patient, and ME/CFS at $5 per patient. And this is taking the more conservative $1 million patient figure. If we used the 2.5 million, obviously the funding per patient for ME/CFS would be much lower. So you see from this chart that on a percentage basis, spending for ME/CFS patients is 2% of what is spent on lupus. 5 is 2% roughly of the 283, 2% of what is spent per patient on MS, and 9% of what is spent per patient on autism. Certainly, these are all serious medical problems, and we don't disparage in any way our government's commitment to spending on them. But I simply must illustrate the enormous disparity in spending. It is not incremental. It is not small. It is orders of magnitude disparity in spending. So this next slide is a little challenging, and it needs a little explanation. These are figures from 2014, again from NIH, in which they summarize the total NIH spending for 242 diseases. So imagine a long list. On the left-hand side is this rank order by dollars spent. In the middle is the condition or disease. And on the right-hand side is the spending. For instance, we see cancer at number 7, with certainly a very reasonable number for spending on cancer in the billions. So I thought I would take a look down this list that, as we will recall, has 242 diseases listed. So we don't see ME/CFS yet here on this slide. Here's the next group. Now I need my glasses. That takes us down through 39. Many illnesses and diseases here. No sign of ME/CFS yet. Let's keep going. Now we're down to number 59, and we're at spending down at the bottom with urologic diseases at 494 million. No sign yet of ME/CFS. Then, in the interest of time, I will skip the many categories ranked 60 to 99. Okay, let's pick it up again. Here are the diseases ranked 100 to 115. Let's see, no sign of ME/CFS yet. And again, in the interest of time, we will skip categories ranked 116 to 180, because I will tell you, ME/CFS is not there. Okay, we're getting toward the bottom now. So here are the diseases ranked 181 to 196. We see a lot of things there. No sign yet of ME/CFS. And then we're going to skip again a large group, 197 to 229, and I will tell you, we do not yet ME/CFS, and at long last, in the very bottom ranking, the bottom one at 242, and if you look up, you see in brown the chronic fatigue syndrome spending, again, at 5 million. I find this shocking. And I will tell you also that this, and just I would note that federal spending for hay fever is higher than federal spending for ME/CFS. And I will also say that the 2014 spending figures we've just reviewed are not an anomaly. When we look at the ME/CFS research budget in the period, the 14 years of 1999 to 2013, it roughly averaged 5.5 million. When we look at a more, the broader period, 1987 to 2012, spending on ME/CFS has actually dropped by 27%, even while total NIH funding more than doubled. So, understanding the economic burden on our nation, the suffering of our citizens, and the new disease validation from the IOM report, what now? With this new report, there are so many actions that can be taken to do right by patients, our family, and our nation's economy, and I ask here today only 3. First, provide funding for biomedical research and studies commensurate with the disease burden. That is, use research dollars to aggressively advance understanding of disease etiology, pathology, diagnostics, treatment, natural history in patients across the spectrum of disease severity, patient age, race, and socioeconomic status. This, the math on this chart is really simple algebra. If we wanted to spend per patient the same amount that we spend on, say, lupus and MS, that figure, do the algebra, it would mean that we would spend roughly $250 million per year on ME/CFS. That is not an unreasonable figure. It is a difficult figure, but it is not an unreasonable figure. We note also that researchers are ready. Our research organization and the many other universities, clinics, and nonprofits who struggle with minuscule research budgets and yet have done extraordinary research can significantly accelerate the pace of discovery. By far, the primary source of basic research funds in our nation's history has been the federal government. That's its right and proper role, we know that, to serve the medical needs of its citizens. And that's what the NIH has done with fantastic effectiveness in other diseases. But at $5 million in research spending and the estimated cost on our economy of 17 to 24 billion, the economic cost to our economy is more than 4,000 times our government's current spending on ME/CFS ID. I challenge the Office of Management and Budget and HHS to find a more effective use of incremental federal funds than to support research in ME/CFS. And as we know, the ME/CFS community does not have a massive lobby. We're here. We do not have established budgets of meaningful size so that we can incrementally build in 5 or 10% more each year. But what we do have now is an IOM report commissioned by our own government that documents the desperate need to put up against the minuscule federal budget. A sea change must occur in federal spending. Further, just to, when I can manage to sort of pull back from the experience we have in our organization of talking regularly with people who are in extraordinary pain and difficulty, you know, this is a fascinating medical research problem. This is the kind of complex problem that attracts brilliant, inquisitive researchers who thrive on using rigorous science to attack complex problems. And there are researchers standing at the ready. Some of them are in this room. Additionally, there are new informatics technologies used in other diseases that can parse through large, complex data sets which reveal insights that are not obvious to we humans. These extraordinary advances in informatics and other areas of medical research, not available even 5 years ago, are all ripe to be applied to this complex illness. This is a medical problem that can be solved. It can be solved. Our second request is that the government remove institutional and organizational barriers within the federal departments. We need a strategic and tactical plan and commitment to solving this disease across agencies, perhaps even an MECFS czar. One immediate change that could be made is to change the location of the research component of funding for this from the Office of Research on Women's Health into one of the NIH institutes where there are stronger budgets and more ability to advocate. Perhaps it's NIAID, which is immunology, or NAIDS, which is neurology. But the point is that this disease needs an institutional home in the federal government that's appropriate and can advocate for dollars and action. And our third request, as called for very explicitly in the IOM report, is to accelerate education of our nation's medical professionals. The patients cannot wait. This means, among other things, updating the CDC's primer and acting on the IOM report's recommendation to disseminate information about the disease to medical schools and to working professionals. This is eminently doable with appropriate funding and a thoughtful implementation plan. In conclusion, this is my favorite quote from the IOM report. This is from the IOM report. So many people have suffered for so long without medical help and compassion. Along with 1 million other Americans and their loved ones, I believe that this is the beginning of the end of this deplorable tragedy that's not worthy of the American people. I think of Cheryl. Cheryl, who was a top student and an athlete, who's now in her early 40s and has been sick for 20 years. She had sudden onset of this illness in 1995. She got her MBA from a prestigious school and promptly became sick. She's in her early 40s, and one of the tragedies that's rarely spoken of is obviously now she and her husband have chosen that they cannot have children. That's an entirely reasonable choice, given the depth of this illness. She also was just diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma several years ago and went through 6 rounds of chemo. She's now clear of lymphoma, but continues to barely be able to function and care for herself, again, with the MECFS. When she was asked to choose between the lymphoma and the MECFS, a horrible choice, she didn't hesitate. She'd take the lymphoma. And as awful and frightening as that was for her, she found therapy, she found compassion, and she is now clear. But the path forward with MECFS is anything but. After 20 years of pain and difficulty, she continues with no end in sight through the end of her life. Now, as she has said, lymphoma can kill you, but MECFS will allow you to linger in a dark, hellish twilight for the rest of your days. And there are thousands and thousands of Cheryls and Williams. And we talk regularly with those patients in our organization, and it truly is heartbreaking This definitive IOM report has once and for all declared that we must commit to funding research to eradicate this dreadful disease. Now there can be no excuses from our nation's health agencies that haven't funded research at a level commensurate with the economic burden it places on our nation or in comparison with other diseases. And no excuses from anyone, doctors, patients, families, coworkers, who dismiss this devastating suffering of 1 million or more of our Americans. You know, our society's understanding of this disease, frankly, now, is where its understanding of, say, MS or autism were 30 years ago. Very poorly understood, largely dismissed, with great skepticism about the cause. I don't know if you remember, I remember growing up that autism was blamed on cold parenting. It wasn't considered a real issue. It was the parents' fault. And MS was generally dismissed as hysteria. I think we all, any of us, now that we're better informed, feel remorse for that now unimaginable insensitivity to the suffering at that time of those with MECF, with autism and MS. And such has been the inhumane dismissal of those who suffer now with ME/CFS. One day, this skepticism about ME/CFS and the poor treatment of those who suffer will be equally unimaginable to everyone. With this highly credible, scholarly IOM report, now is the time to commit to solving ME/CFS. Thank you.